Tonight, I'm going to be discussing, to begin with, Chapter 11 from the book, The Places That Scare You by Pema Chodron. And this particular chapter is about enhancing training in joy. She has discussed the four limitless ones, and limitless joy is the third limitless one. And so now we're going to talk about how to enhance that. And she starts out with a quote by Patrul Rinpoche, which I really like, so I'm going to read it. Just train yourself to have a kind heart always and in all situations. It's a very simple instruction. It's a little harder to, you might say, follow through on that instruction. But that's the idea about training, is that we can't do it now, but this is the goal we want to work towards. And we want to do what we can so we can move towards that goal. So she has a practice. She calls it sharing the heart practice. And so it's done similar to Tonglen with visualizations and so forth. And the idea is any pain we experience, we breathe it into the heart with the recognition that others have experienced this too. And then she says, after breathing it in, think of others and sharing it, whether it be pleasure, tenderness, cherishing, or rejoicing. When life is pleasant, well, this is a quote of hers in 68, when life is pleasant, think of others. When life is a burden, think of others. So any pain, we breathe it into our heart, and then pleasure and tenderness, cherishing, rejoicing, we think about breathing that out to others, sharing it with others. It's too good to keep to ourselves. And she says it's really important when you're doing this to be mindful of what you are experiencing, what kinds of feelings and so forth. When you are doing this, do you tighten up? Is there some aversion? Do you have difficulty with one or the other and so forth? It's really important because part of this training in developing and deepening our bodhicitta, our awake mind, is getting to know ourselves extremely well. And again, what we're interested here is what we are experiencing in the present, not what we have experienced in the past or what we could experience in the future. There's a story about a Zen monk, which fits in here. And so this Zen monk was out walking in the jungle one day, and he saw ahead of him a tiger. And he thought, maybe I can kind of get away from this without the tiger seeing me. So he stopped and stayed very, very still, and then took a step backwards without moving the rest of his body. And then he took a step backwards with his other foot. Well, for every step backwards he took, the tiger took a step forwards towards him. And this went on for a short distance, and he came to a cliff. And he looked down the cliff, and there really wasn't much there. It was a cliff. But he did see that there were places where he could put his feet and put his hands And there were some, um, I don't know if you would call them shrubs, let's just say some woody plants that were growing in some places on the face of the cliff. And he decided that it would be better to lower himself down the cliff than to stay there and be eaten by the tiger. So gradually he went down the cliff and got out of reach of the tiger. And then he got to a place where he could not go down any further. And the tiger, his head was hanging over the cliff, looking right at the monk. And the monk looked around, looking for a place where he could grab and move and get away. And he saw some wild strawberries that were blooming. Excuse me, they had bloomed. They were bearing fruit. There were actual wild strawberry berries on the plants. And so he picked one and put it in his mouth. And he said, "My, what a delicious strawberry." The point being is that we can experience the present, and no matter what the future looks like or what has happened in the past, but we can experience the present fully and completely and thoroughly and find pleasure in it. And then we can give that pleasure to others who are suffering. May all beings that are suffering from hunger have the pleasure of enjoying that strawberry, for instance, would be what a person could do in a situation like that. The interesting thing about painful experiences and emotions and fear is that these connect us to the rest of the world. Everybody is having these kinds of feelings, one way or another. Needless to say, right now, the world and the United States in particular is full of fear, whether it be COVID or a fear of rioting or fear of another group taking away the privileges that you have, and so forth. Fear of change. Fear of being dominated. So, when we experience these things, this can be used to connect us with all the other beings in the world. So breathe in the pain of all who are experiencing the same thing. And then when you're experiencing pleasure, give that to others. And she finishes this chapter by talking about traffic jams and how traffic jams are a great place to practice Tonglen. And I would have to agree with that. The conventional, you might say, response to traffic jams is that I shouldn't be in this traffic jam. It's a pain. I'm wasting my time. Da, 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 da. But we can use something like that to practice Tonglen and help us connect with other people. Everybody in the traffic jam is experiencing similar to things, similar to what you are experiencing, similar emotions, and so on and so forth. And so we can just relax with it and let it be and practice Tonglen. So that's how she finishes this 11th chapter. The 12th chapter is described as thinking bigger. And this is about equanimity, which is the fourth of the four limitless ones. And technically, the three other limitless ones start with equanimity. Equanimity is mentioned last, but quite honestly, we are wanting all sentient beings equally to have happiness and the root of happiness, all sentient beings equally to be free of suffering and the root of suffering. And the same thing with joy. So equanimity is welcoming all beings, inviting all of them to enjoy life. Now, like the others, we have to work with fear and aversion here. That training in equanimity takes courage. It takes compassion, loving kindness, and joy. And so, in her words, whatever appears, sickness, health, poverty, wealth, sorrow, and joy, we welcome and get to know them all. This is on page 70. And so the idea of equanimity is, again, we don't get carried, we train so that we don't get carried away when circumstances change, whether they become really good or really bad circumstances that come. There's a story, it's a horse story, that illustrates this. And so the story is, it was a village, little village in Tibet, and a man, he had some horses, not many, but he had some horses. And one day he got up, and there in his corral was a wild stallion that had gotten in it overnight. And so he quickly went out there and closed the gate to the corral. And now we had this very beautiful stallion that would be strong, excellent breeding stock, and so forth, and actually a very valuable possession. And so the village people, when they heard of this, they all came to his house and started saying, what a wonderful, wonderful surprise this is. You have such good fortune. You are so lucky, and so forth. And he maintained his equanimity by saying, maybe so, maybe not. Well, the next morning when he got up, the wild stallion had broken the corral and ran away. And not only that, but he took all the horses that this man had. So now the man was left without any horses. And when the villagers heard about this, they came to console him and saying, oh, what a tragedy, what bad fortune you have. This is terrible, and so forth. And he said, no, maybe so, maybe not. The next day, when he got up, the stallion had returned, and it had the man's herd of horses with him, and he had his own herd of mares with him. And now the villagers came and said, you are the wealthiest person in the whole village. How wonderful this is, how fantastic it is. Your luck is so just incredibly good. And he said, well, maybe so, maybe not. Well, that day, his son tried to break the stallion, and the stallion threw him, and he broke his leg. Now the villagers came and said, oh, what a terrible tragedy. Who's going to help you with the spring planting, with all the work that needs to be done, taking care of the herd of yaks and greys, and so on and so forth? And he said, maybe so, maybe not. The next day, the Mongol army came, and they took all the young men, they captured them and took them away to fight their wars. they left the man with the broken leg, that he was no use to them. So that's how the story ends. So to kind of finish up this chapter, bodhisattvas aren't for or against. It's not about liking or disliking. The 13th chapter will go into this in more detail. So it's not taking sides, being for this or against that. It doesn't mean that you are rudderless or that you don't have ethics. That is wrong. You will have ethics. However, you don't solidify the situation by this is what I like, this is what I dislike, I am for this, and I'm against that. That when it comes right down to it, we live in a very, very fluid world. And just for instance, I have been watching some videos of protests for the George Floyd kind of memorial and to protest his unnecessary killing. And they run the gamut. But on the other hand, there was one that I saw, and I got, what would I say? I got tipped off about this sheriff because they interviewed him on the PBS NewsHour. It might have been yesterday. He was from the county that Flint, Michigan is located, and they had a protest march, and he took off his gun, took off his baton, took off his helmet, and he joined them. And he kind of hugged some of the African-American leaders that were there in this march and so forth. He didn't try to stop it. He had his officers that did remain on guard to make sure things were orderly and so forth, but he joined it as an ordinary person. And I saw another video that was done by a TV crew in the Twin Cities. And so there were a lot of police at this one area. And I think there was everything from police to state troopers to National Guard. And there may have been others there too, but lots and lots of security. And so they were arresting everybody that was at this place. And it took hours and hours. And the reporters stayed there for the whole thing. And this particular segment, he was talking at how well the police and the demonstrators were getting along. They were becoming friends. They interviewed two demonstrators, and they didn't feel bad about getting arrested and detained. And as they were interviewing one, there was a policeman in full riot gear behind, but still in view. And as they're interviewing the demonstrator, some of the things that the demonstrator said made this trooper smile. So it's being open and seeing every situation as individual rather than making judgments and solidifying things. The next chapter is chapter 13, and this is called Meeting the Enemy. The enemy in this case is self-deception. And she says that bravery is being without self-deception. She says that when we train in clarity and steadfastness, this leads to seeing inner obstacles and things that we want to deny. Denial is extremely common in samsara. And it's easier for us to see other people that are in denial than it is to see ourselves and our own form of denial. But we can do this. Again, we need clarity, and we need steadfastness, which is to keep at it, to don't turn away. And so she talks about things like judgmentalness, pettiness, arrogance, resentment, jealousy. And this is the short list. It's actually a pretty long list. Any of the kleshas, we can deny that we have them. So what we need to do is accept them and work with them with care and compassion. If we can do that, they lose their power. So it's important, this idea of care and compassion, when we see an inner obstacle, when we see that we are being judgmental and so forth, we need to work with them with care rather than have this inner dialogue with what a bad person we are to have done this. How could we ever, you? And you probably know what I'm talking about, that inner critic that uses very harsh language. What we need to do is learn how to not pay attention to the inner critic. We don't have to eliminate the inner critic. We have to treat that inner critic with care and compassion too. But we don't follow the advice of that inner critic. We take responsibility for our lives and where we are going. And this is what I like, because I can relate to this. And it is that we carry a lot of baggage from the past. And if we really look closely, we find that most of it isn't needed. It's like taking your winter clothing to Hawaii for a vacation. That's what we do. We take all kinds of baggage from the past and bring it into the present. And it keeps things very solid. And it keeps us from experiencing things freshly. So to go into this in depth, she now talks about the four limitless ones and their near enemies and their far enemies. The near enemies are similar to the quality, but not, what would you say, no cigar. They're not the same. And there's a misunderstanding. And this misunderstanding hardens us. It separates us. It keeps us from having this care and compassion for others. So the far enemy is the opposite of the quality. So the first of the four immeasurables is loving kindness. it's the near enemy is attachment. And attachment here is characterized by clinging, and the clinging is different from, having love for another person. It actually can be somewhat suffocating because it involves you and your interest above the interest of the person that you are clinging to. She used the Tibetan word lenchak. And so she says that this clinging, the free-flowing love gets stuck. It kind of solidifies. And she says there are three common ones, and it's between parents and children, between lovers, and between spiritual teachers and their students. So it inhibits growth, as I just mentioned, and it's the source of blindness and irritation. I think we're all familiar with, even in a family where there's a lot of love between the parents and the children, or between the couple, that still there are times when they get irritated with each other, that problems arise and so forth. It is not, and they lived happily ever after situation. She says that loving kindness is based on a genuine appreciation and care for the well-being of another person. Respect for an individual's value. That's on page 76. And it is unconditional. It's not based on being worthy or unworthy. It's not based on being loving towards us or not. This is this idea of free-flowing love. So she says the lenchak can be very close, but later, due to what they did, we can have resentment and anger towards them. So at 10 o'clock in the morning, we can feel very close to this person, whether it be a partner, a child, or whoever. And then 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we are slightly irritated and maybe even have some resentment and anger towards them. That's the way it works. And she mentioned spiritual teachers. And again, this is something that can happen. We can get very attached to our spiritual teachers and think that they're not paying enough attention to me. Other people, I remember when Rinpoche would have a program at KTD, everybody would want to have an interview with him. And he would try to be very, very accommodating, but not everybody would. And sometimes there would be some irritation about why this person got an interview, and perhaps a long interview, and I got a short interview or did not get an interview at all. I can tell you this, that Rinpoche did not play favorites. He loved his students, but he loved them equally. So the far enemy of loving kindness is hatred or aversion. And of course, the problem here is that it strengthens the illusion that we are separate, that fear and vulnerability are behind the hatred and the aversion. And so we put up walls for protection. So instead of softening, we harden. So that is the near and the far enemy for loving kindness. For compassion, the near enemy is pity. She also talks about overwhelm. And then the third is idiot compassion. Pity, she has another term here, which is, quote, professional warmth, unquote. And the idea is you are the helper, the other is helpless. Therefore, this relationship is actually distant instead of warmth and support. That you're actually doing this to make yourself feel better, more important, more valuable, more powerful, or whatever. And what I have seen from my own personal experience is that a lot of times that the compassion, like people that work in an animal shelter or even a shelter for abused women and so forth, that they have had a lot of trauma in their lives and they have a low opinion of themselves, and they're doing this to kind of bolster their own opinion of themselves, showing that they can do something that is worthwhile. And of course, they do have a connection with the pain of an abused animal or an abused person and so forth. But it's not this direct relationship. It's close, but it's still solidifying things where you have the one person above and they are the helper, and then they are helping the helpless. Overwhelm is the second near enemy of compassion. And this is a sense of helplessness, that there's so much suffering that we feel we can't do anything. And she has some remedies for this. And the first one is to train with less challenging and a more workable subject. Start easy. And she used the example of a woman whose son was a heroin addict, and she just had burnt out. She had gotten overwhelmed. But then she saw on TV their hometown football team. I don't know if it was high school or it was a professional team. But anyway, the team lost, and she saw all the disappointment and the sadness in the faces of the fans as well as the players. And so she decided to connect with these people that she saw on TV and did Tonglen for them and made compassionate aspirations. And by doing this, she developed, you might say, the strength to work with more difficult subjects and eventually use her son, the heroin addict, in her Tonglen practice. Remedy number 2 for overwhelm is, instead of shutting down, keep focused on the other person and their suffering. In other words, you start pushing yourself. And it's a delicate balance, and you have to pay attention to your feelings, how you are doing. But just focus on the other person for longer than you have in the past, where it's a little uncomfortable, but you can still do it. And she says, and if you can't do it, then don't beat yourself up with that inner critic. Accept it as your current limitation, and make aspirations to be able to do this in the future. Make aspirations to be able to go beyond your limitations in the future. And the third form of this near enemy, overwhelm, is idiot compassion. And this is what she says, quote, "This is when we avoid conflict and protect our good image by being kind when we should say a definite no." This is on page 78. This is about setting boundaries. That there are some people that we need to set boundaries with. She uses the phrase aggressive people. We need to say enough is enough. We don't let others walk over us. And so this takes clarity and it takes wisdom. But it's important to not just agree to everything that people want you to do. So the far enemy is cruelty, having a desire to hurt the defenseless or the weak. You know, just the opposite of compassion. So the next one is joyfulness. The near enemy is overexcitement. Kind of like manic behavior. That this separates us from others. On 79, she says, authentic joy is not a euphoric state or a feeling of being high. We rejoice in the good fortune of others and our own good fortune. And then, of course, when we rejoice in our own good fortune, then we give it to the world. But rejoicing in the good fortune of others is an excellent antidote for jealousy. There's nothing wrong with being happy. Absolutely nothing wrong with being happy. And of course, then you share the happiness. The far enemy is envy. And this can be very subtle. So again, we need to maintain our awareness and continually be looking within for what's going on in our mind. We have to see ourselves clearly. Then the last one of these four limitless ones is equanimity. The near enemy is detachment or indifference. And especially with spiritual practice. She says, feelings of being above and beyond the messiness of life. It can have the feeling of being open, that is being above the messiness of life. You could have feeling friendly, sincere, and of course, proud of your accomplishments. And then, of course, what will happen is something will crop up unexpectedly, and maybe we become embarrassed, or something causes us some distress or some anger, and then we've lost this equanimity and we feel terrible about it. That it's like you go up from this kind of being indifferent and detached above everything to now, oh, I got totally sucked into this. What's wrong with me? Da 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 da. And so you go back and forth, back and forth. So she says, practice compassion towards yourself. Stop struggling with yourself. And finally, the far enemy is prejudice, self-righteousness. Taking sides for or against, being closed-minded and having enemies. And again, this is a great world that we live in today for helping us train in not taking sides and to avoid self-righteousness. So on page 80, here is a quote. If we wish to alleviate injustice and suffering, we have to do it with an unprejudiced mind. And of course, that's what we want to do, is alleviate injustice and suffering. And the last three sentences in the chapter are, I feel, extremely important, so I'm going to read them, and then I will open this up to question and answers. We accept ourselves and others complete with imperfections. We develop trust in our own open and forgiving mind. In doing so, we discover the strength that allows us to enter into the suffering of the world.